The Technology History Podcast. Exciting stories about the development of technology by Christian Steinbach. Hi everybody, and welcome to episode number 7 in English of my Technology History Podcast. Last week I discussed various technical speed records from cars to aviation to space travel. In episode number 7, entitled Records, Part 2, I would like to present a few more interesting records and record hunts. After dealing with speed last time, we now turn to height. The desire to reach high is also fundamentally human. Who didn't want to reach the highest point on the climbing frame as a child? And even in the Bible, in the story of the Tower of Babel, humanity's striving for equality with God is symbolized by the striving for height. This interesting story is found in the book of Genesis, the first of the 5 books of Moses, practically at the very beginning of the Bible. Incidentally, God ends the megalomaniacal tower building project by making people to speak different languages from then on. It is interesting that some researchers actually link archaeological finds in Babylon to this story. In any case, as history progressed, the builders were not particularly impressed by this warning not to aim too high. The Great Pyramid of Cheops in Egypt is an impressive example of how humans were able to build structures about 150 meters high long before the beginning of our era. It is interesting to realize that this scale would persist for a long time. Even the imposing cathedrals of the Middle Ages, such as Cologne Cathedral, vary in height between 150 and 160 meters. Apparently, a limit had been reached here that only the technology of the industrial age could overcome. Even the Washington Monument of 1884, at just under 170 meters, remains close to this former magnitude. Only modern metal construction made it possible to reach a height of over 300 meters, with the Eiffel Tower completed in Paris 5 years later. The events surrounding the controversial construction of the Eiffel Tower are also an interesting story, but would go beyond the scope of this episode. In the 1930s, construction technology had advanced to the point where the record could go to normal buildings again. First to the Chrysler Building, which is about 320 meters high, and then to the Empire State Building, which is about 380 meters high without the antenna. Both of them are located in New York. In the post-war period, various transmission towers competed for the record, breaking the 500-meter mark in 1960. Incidentally, the tallest one belonged to Radio Warsaw and stood in Poland from 1974 until its collapse in 1991. It was almost 650 meters high. When a trip around the world 20 years ago took me to Dubai, construction was just beginning on the Burj Khalifa, which at 830 meters was completed in 2010 and is now the tallest building in the world. It houses, among other things, 900 apartments and 43 offices. If people want to reach even higher, they must use technical aids or climb high mountains. And here it quickly becomes clear that the sensitive human organism is not designed for high altitudes. The rapid decrease in air pressure with altitude and the associated reduction in the amount of inhalable oxygen ensure that, for example, the highest mountain in the world, Mount Everest in the Himalayas, could only be climbed in 1953. And to do this, Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay needed not only complex logistics but also oxygen equipment. Although Peter Habeler and Reinhold Messner managed to climb Mount Everest 25 years later without oxygen equipment, it should not be forgotten that these two were extreme athletes who had also undergone special training. It's astonishing, however, that Arthur Berson and Reinhard Bürsing managed to ascend over 10,000 meters in a hydrogen-filled balloon as early as July 1901. They also breathed oxygen from bottles. Nevertheless, they lost consciousness at an altitude of over 10,000 meters. As the balloon descended, however, both regained consciousness and were able to land safely. The potential of the balloon was thus clear, and so was the fact that sensitive humans must be well protected from the bad conditions of altitude during even higher ascents. Therefore, Auguste Piccard developed a pressurized capsule which he and his colleague Paul Kipfer used to ascend to almost 16,000 meters while attached to a balloon. In subsequent years, this record was slightly improved several times. When Joseph Kittinger ascended to an altitude of almost 30 kilometers in a balloon in 1955 and parachuted down from there, space travel was already in the spotlight. The main goal was to demonstrate that astronauts could still escape even at that altitude with a suitable protective suit and appropriate equipment. With the beginning of space travel, the concept of altitude finally entered entirely new dimensions. It actually makes less sense to speak of altitude than of distance from Earth. For Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space in April 1961, this altitude, or distance from Earth, depending on your preference, was already over 300 kilometers. During the Voskhod 2 flight 4 years later, when Alexei Leonov became the first human to undertake a spacewalk, it was already almost 500 kilometers. A year later, the two Gemini astronauts, Pete Conrad and Richard Gordon, achieved another major leap. By the way, Gemini was a program that prepared the American moon landings and tested spacewalks, dockings, and more. During Conrad and Gordon's flight in Gemini 11, the two docked with a rocket stage that had previously been launched into space, which was then ignited and carried the capsule to almost 1,400 kilometers. However, the record that still stands today is shared by 3 astronauts who actually went down in space history for a completely different reason. They are Jim Lovell, Fred Haise and Jack Swigert, who almost lost their lives during the Apollo 13 flight. On the way to the moon, one of their oxygen tanks exploded, resulting in the loss of the main engine. Therefore, a direct way back to Earth was not possible for the spacecraft. Instead, it used the moon's gravity, which tossed the spacecraft around like a hammer thrower, sending it back to Earth. During this involuntary orbit, the astronauts reached a distance of over 401,000 kilometers from Earth. However, this distance seems almost tiny when compared to the distances of the unmanned space probes that were launched to explore our solar system. The current record holder is Voyager 1, launched in 1977. It has now left the solar system and reached a distance of over 24 billion kilometers. That's about 60,000 times the distance traveled by the Apollo 13 astronauts. After these dizzying heights, we now change direction and go into the depth. Those who want to avoid the water can instead venture into a mine to quite impressive depth. There are 2 gold mines in South Africa that reach a depth of about 3,900 meters. When diving into water, as with ascending to great heights, the problem arises that humans are not designed for this environment. They must carry breathable air and simultaneously cope with the rapidly increasing water pressure. It wasn't until 1960 that the Trieste succeeded in diving into a depth of approximately 10,900 meters in one of the deepest places in the world, in the Mariana Trench in the Pacific Ocean. It was built by the already mentioned Auguste Piccard with his son Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh on board. This record was only slightly improved in 2012. Before I conclude this episode, I would like to mention 3 more technical records that, although perhaps not as relevant as the ones I have discussed, still particularly impressed me. Did you know, for example, that the world's largest cinema screen is actually located in Germany? It's the IMAX cinema in Leonberg. It measures 38 by 22 meters. The highest fountain is in Saudi Arabia and reaches incredible 312 meters. And if you ever wondered where the longest bridge in the world is, it is located in China between Beijing and Shanghai and is 165 kilometers long. With this, I conclude episode number 7, entitled Records, Part 2. If you enjoyed the podcast, I would be very happy about a subscription. And maybe you know someone who is also interested in this topic and to whom you would like to recommend my podcast. Finally, my thanks go to Walk-In Music from Pixabay, whose song I was allowed to incorporate into the intro. Thank you for your interest and see you next time on the Technology History Podcast.